Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Kuf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, 10 lines from the bottom. The Gemara begins with three different queries, three different questions in halacha. The first of them being about a kila, a canopy. Says the Gemara, Sholchu le b'nei Bashkar la Levi. The people of Bashkar, a locale that was outside of Eretz Yisrael, asked the following three questions to Levi. Kila mahu. What is the din in regards to making a kila and canopy on Shabbos? Kishusa bekarma mahu. If a person plants, he has a hops kshusa in a vineyard. Is that a problem of kilaim or not? Mace b'yantif mahu. If a person is a mace on yantif, how do we handle the burial? Says the Gemara, Ada ozil nach nafshe de Levi. Meanwhile, before the questions were answered, Levi passed away. Omar Shmuel l'Rab Menashio. Shmuel said to Rab Menashio, Ichakimas sholach lehu. If you're wise in these areas, then send them a responsa, a tshuva to these questions. Sholach lehu. Rab Menashio sent them the following. Kilo chazarnu al kol tzidei kilo v'lo matzinu lo tzad heter. We reviewed all of the area of kila, and we saw that there's no way in making a heter, making a kila on Shabbos. It's aser al oil arai. Asks Shmuel v'lishlech luhu k'derami bar Yechezkel. Why didn't you then send them that there's a heter according to Rami bar Yechezkel, which we learned on the previous daf? On Daf Kuf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, Rabbi Yechezkel taught us that if there is a chut or meshicha, either a rope or a string that's tied to the end of the kila, some learn that it was already opened, a tefach, then on Shabbos you can go ahead and pull it open, the entire canopy. So why didn't you then tell them this heter? Lefi she'enam b'nei Torah. Rabbi Shasha said because they are not b'nei Torah, and therefore they're liable to then make more kulas when it's not appropriate. And therefore, he didn't tell them that it's mutter here as well. Keshusa bekarma irbuva. He answered them in regards to hops, planting hops in a vineyard. It's a problem of kilaim. Because although the shaila was, are they considered to be plants or trees? Whereby if it's trees, there's no issue of kilaim. No, he said the hops are considered to be plants in regards to then planting with a vineyard, and therefore it's an issue of kilayim. Shmuel asked, why didn't you send them that which Rabbi Tarfon said? The Tanya kishus, in regards to kishus hops, Rabbi Tarfon says, Ein kilayim bekerim, v'chacham rabim kilayim bekerim. It's a machlokes Rabbi Tarfon and the chachamim. Rabbi Tarfon said there is no kilayim. Therefore, there's no issue of planting the hops in a vineyard. And we have established that the halacha is that which are makel, in this case Rabbi Tarfon, in Eretz Yisrael, then in Chutz La'aretz will actually paskin that halacha. And therefore, in Chutz La'aretz, where this locale was present, there in Chutz La'aretz, whereby it would be mutter to plant hops in a vineyard. Answers Rav Masharsha lefi she'enan b'nei Torah, because since they're not b'nei Torah, they're liable to then make kulas when they're inappropriate, and therefore he didn't want to give them this kula either. Machris Rav. Now the Gemara brings a few different opinions in regards to them planting hops in a vineyard. Machris Rav. Rav, he announced, and he lived outside of Eretz Yisrael. Hayman de boile mizro keshuso bekarmo lizro. He announced that those who want to plant hops in a vineyard could do so. Rav Amro goes to the other extreme. Rav Amro chasida mangid ilave. He would administer flogs. He would flog those who planted hops in a vineyard. Rav Mesharsha yohiv le pruto letinoik Nochri v'zorale. Rav Mesharsha, he held indeed that the halacha mi'ikir hadin is that it's mutter to plant hops in a vineyard in Chutz La'aretz, like Rabbi Tarfon's halacha. However, he wanted to do it with a shinui, that people should not make a mistake and think that they can do it lichatchila in other places as well. So he gave to a Gentile child to plant for him. Ask the Gemara, V'liten lei letinok Yisrael. Why not give it to a Tinok Yisrael? Answers Rav Mesharsha, because Osi lemisrach. Mesharsha says because the Tinok, if he's a child, it's true, it won't be a problem then, but maybe when he will grow to be an adult, a bar mitzvah, then he'll continue then to do this. Why don't you give it to a gadol nachri? Answers the Gemara, because nachri also leichlufe b'Yisrael. If a person sees a nachri planting hops on behalf of somebody, another Jew in Chutz La'aretz, then a person might think that it's permissible for a Jew to do that too. He might think it's a Jew who's doing it. He won't know that it's a Gentile who's planting. Meis, in regards to the third question, Sholach Luhu, he answered the following response. Lo yisasku bei. Don't get involved with the mace at all on Yontif. Lo Yehudoin v'lo Armoin. Not Jews and not Gentiles. Lo b'yomtiv rishon v'lo b'yomtiv sheni. Not on the first day of Yontif, not on the second day of Yontif. Eini asked the Gemara. V'ho amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Shilas amar Rabbi Asi. Uvda hava bebekinishto de ma'on b'yomtiv hasamuch l'Shabbos. There was a ma'aseh that took place in the area called Ma'on on Yontif that was samuch l'Shabbos. We're on top of Kuf Lamed Tes Lamed Beis. V'lo yadano imi lifonel imi la'acharel. And I don't know, he said, whether it was before Shabbos or after Shabbos, meaning if the Yontif fell out on Erev Shabbos, whereby if there was a mace on Erev Shabbos, you would not be able to then bury him on the next day on Shabbos. Therefore, they were makil to then take care of the mace that first day of Yom Tif. Or if Yom Tif came out to be on Motzei Shabbos, and the mace died on Shabbos, whereby you'd have to wait another day. So therefore, they were makil again. So they came before Rabbi Yochanan, they asked him what they should do. And he said to them, Yisasku bei amamin. You should have the Gentiles then go ahead and deal with the kavura of the mace. So we see over here that indeed we are oisek in the mace on Yontif. V'omar Rav, and Rabbi said further, mace be Yontif Rishon Yisasku bei amamin. If it's the first day of Yontif, then we have the Gentiles then koiver the mace. B'Yontif Sheni Yisasku bei Yisrael. On the second day of Yontif, then the Jews themselves should then be busy with the burial. And even though when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, when the second day of Yontif is more machmir, is more severe than the second day of Yontif, and therefore when it comes to a Beitzah, we say it's the Yom Arichta, it's like one long day. So over here too, nonetheless, we say that you should then be busy yourself on that second day of Rosh Hashanah, even the Jews, to be koiver the mace. So how can you have told them not to be oisek in the mace whatsoever? Not a Jew and not a Gentile, not a Yontif Rishon, not a Yom Tisheni. Answers the Gemara lefisha einon b'nei Torah. He answers similarly because they're not b'nei Torah, and therefore he's concerned that they would be makil in an inappropriate way in other cases as well. Says the Gemara weiter, Amar Ravi Avin bar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Chama bar Guya, Mis'ateif Adam bekilo ubekaskaseho v'yoytze l'vishazarayim b'shabis ve'enoi choishesh. He says a person can enwrap himself with a kila, with a large cloth that's normally used as a canopy. So now it's a beged. And he can go out with the kila, although it has its attachments, strings attached to it, and go out with it on Shabbos. Here the chiddush is that the strings attached to it, although they're not going to be used at all when he wraps himself, they're normally used to then tie to the poles of the canopy, and yet here he can go out not only with the kila, but also these ties, these strings with it. and there's no concern whatsoever. It's not a problem of being mechalo Shabbos. It's muter lechatchila. Ask the Gemara, but my shna mid Rav Huna. Why is this different than what which Rav Huna had said? The Rav Huna, Rav. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, Hayoytze betalish she'eno mitzuyetzes kilchasa b'Shabbos chayiv chatos. A person who goes out with a talis that doesn't have all of the tzitzis properly tied on it is going to be chayiv chatos on Shabbos. In other words, let's say you have a beged and one of the corners doesn't have the tzitzis tied to it. So you only have 3 of the 4 corners where you have tzitzis properly tied to the beged. So it says over here, if a person goes out with such a beged where only 3 of the 4 corners are tied with tzitzis, he's going to be chayiv chatos, because after all, we say that those tzitzis are a masui. They're not part of that beged. So why don't we say the same thing over here as well? That when he unwraps himself with the kila, granted the kila is a beged, but the strings are not. They're a masui, because he's not using those strings at all. Answers the Gemara, tzitzis legabe talis chashive velo batli. Hani lo chashivu batli. The Gemara makes the following chiluk. When it comes to tzitzis, so tzitzis have chashivus in themselves, and therefore they're not bottle, because after all, like Rabbi Nuchananu explains, he has 3 corners that are tied. He wants to keep those, so they can go ahead and add and then tie the 4th one to make it proper tzitzis. So therefore, those tzitzis are not bottle. Memele, if he goes out with that beged with only 3 corners being tied, then it's going to be chayiv chatos. Masha'en came over here by the kila. The strings are subordinate; they're bottle to the entire kila because they have no chashivus themselves. Says the Gemara weiter. Now the Mishnah had stated that the Chachamim said you cannot be toilin a mishameres on Yontif. That means to say that you can't put a cloth over a kli to be a strainer on Yontif. And the Gemara ultimately said that it's doime mikzas to making an oil arai, and therefore it's a problem of uvdin dechol ultimately. So here the Gemara states, Omar Rabbe Barav Huna me'arim odam al hamishameres b'yomtiv litlois ba rimoinim v'toile ba shmorim. A person can make a ha'arama by looking as if he's going to then set up the mishameres for rimonim to place his pomegranates on it, whereby it's not going to be an issue of uvde dechol, because it's not an issue of straining, and therefore there's no problem whatsoever if we would use it just to place his rimonim on top of this kli that has a beged over it. And that's only harama. He can do that and then ultimately place his wine on it, whereby use it as a strainer. Now we said that the Chacham do allow you, if you already had a previously strainer set up, you can go ahead and put wine in it, because after all, it's for oichel nefes, and that's mutar and yantiv. So here it says that you can even set up the strainer, because you're doing a harama that you're using it for rimonim. Says the Gemara, Omrav Ashivu de Tola ba rimonim. He has to actually put the rimonim initially before he then uses it to then pour his wine and use it as a strainer. Ask the Gemara, what's the difference between this and the following brisa? It states, Matilin sheikha b'moyed l'tzorech hamoyed shelo l'tzorech hamoyed oser. A person can brew beer on chol hamoyed for the moed, but he's not able to do so for after the moed. It's a tircha yisera, and therefore there's no heter to then make beer for after the chag. But during the chag, for the purpose of the chag, he could make echad sheichar tamarim ve'echad sheichar sa'arim. Whether it's beer that's for date beer or it's beer that's from hops, from barley, which is more of a tircha, nonetheless he can do so. Even though he has old beer, and normally you're not allowed to then again make beer for after Yontif, ma'arim v'shoisim min achadash. He can make it harama, it states over here in the brisa, and he can drink from the new one. So here we're saying over here he can make a harama, and he doesn't have to then do anything different. He doesn't have to then do like we said before that he makes a harama, but he has to place the rimonim. He can go straight to making harama and then do what he wants to do, in this case, making beer. Answers the Gemara, there's a difference between the case that we said before where he has to place the rimoin on the strainer and then go ahead and use the strainer, versus over here we can go directly and make the new beer. Because hasam loy muchacha milsa, hacha mucha milsa. Over there, in regards to brewing the beer, there it's not muchacha milsa. A person does not know that you're using beer that you don't have other old beer from. In other words, they don't know that you have old beer that you're coming to then now make new beer. But over in the case of the rimoin, there it's obvious to any onlooker that if you're going to make a strainer, the normal thing that a strainer is used for is to strain wine. So if you don't place a pomegranate on top of the strainer to begin with, then it's obvious that you made the strainer for the purpose of straining wine. Says the Gemara, "Vayter Amru le Rabbanan le Rav Ashi, Chazimar Haitzubim Rabban Rav Huna bar Rabbi Chiyun Shmei, V'amei le Rav Huna Bereid Chalvoin Shmei." There was a Talmid Chacham who had the name as either Rav Huna bar Rabbi Chivun Shmei, or either his name was Rav Huna Bereid Chalvoin Shmei. Whatever it is, they saw him doing a harama. The shoka bra, the tumo umanach bebarze de dano. They saw that he took a part of a garlic and he took that piece of garlic and he stopped up the whole of a chavis. V'omar, he said, la'atzniya kemechavna. I just put the piece of garlic, the clove of garlic, only to then place it there because I wanted to then put it for future use. But indeed, it was a harama. Another harama that he did, that he went and he slept on a boat. And the boat took off. It was a boat that was driven, of course, by a Gentile, and it took him to the other side so that he can go ahead and view and watch his payros to see what's going on with them. Which again is a problem on Yontif, either because it's a Karmelis and you're allowed to go and take a boat across the Carmelis, or because over here we're talking about a situation where if he's on the boat, so you're not allowed to then use a boat and a raft even on Shabbos, and yet this is what he's doing. Says the Gemara, and he said, V'omar, he said, Ana lemeinam kimichavna. I only had kavana to then take a rest, and therefore I fell asleep in the boat. But all this was a harama. So the Chacham were complaining to Rav Ashi that they saw this man doing harama, and he was a Talmid Chacham. So you should do something about it. Omar lehu harama kamrisu. You're saying that he did harama. Harama b'dirabanan he. Harama in a dirabanan. It shouldn't be an issue because sorbe rabbanan la'aslim ma'avid lechatchila. As a Talmid Chacham, there's not a concern that he's going to do this lechatchila. And therefore, if he makes a haram, it's mutter. The Gemara now brings the next Mishnah. Here the Mishnah is discussing, again, the issue of boirer. Until now we said that there are prohibited ways of straining. Now the Mishnah is going to tell us about permissible ways of straining. Says the Mishnah, Noistin mayim al gabe hashmorim bishvil sheyatzoilu. It says you can put water, if you already have on a strainer, let's say before Shabbos, you already have the shmorim that are on top of the strainer, you can go ahead and pour water, which will then cause the remaining yayin that's left in the shmorim to then go out into the water and be strained that way. So here, the guy is going to explain, but here there's no issue of boirer because it's true that the yain is being separated out from the shmorim, but it's going together with the water, and the water itself, therefore, which was put in the first place, this is now tafil to the water, and therefore there's no issue of boirer. And you can go ahead and you can strain wine. You can take wine. Here we're talking about wine that went a little bit bad, meaning to say that has some white flakes in it. And therefore the majority of people do strain such wine, but it's roy lishtia. And therefore you take that wine and you can pour it onto a sudar, because this beged, which is not a typical way of straining the wine, or a kfifa mitzris, which is a sal, it's a basket that's made out of palm twigs, which again is considered to be a shinui. So therefore it's mutter then to then pour this type of wine on these things that are not a typical strainers. If you have a sieve, a strainer that strained chardal before Shabbos, and the mustard is sitting on the bottom of the strainer, so now on Shabbos you can place a beitza. So although the beitza itself is going to then go through the strainer, the purpose over here is to then tzoveya, to color the mustard. And therefore it's not going to be an issue, as the Gemara will explain, it's not going to be an issue of boirer. V'oisin inoimlin b'Shabbos, you can make a mixture on Shabbos. This is a mixture of wine, of honey, and pepper on Shabbos, as long as you don't beat it very well, but you can mix it on Shabbos, and it's not considered a tircha, yesera. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'Shabbos b'kois. Rabbi Yehuda says there's hagbolos, there's limitations to this. He says on Shabbos you can only do an amount of a cup, a kois. B'yantif b'login, on yantif a bigger kli. Uvemoyed b'chavis, a moed even bigger than that. Rabbi Tzadok omer, it depends. Hakol lefia orchin. It depends on how many guests one has. If he has many guests, then he can be more makel, and he can then make even more anomlin. If, however, he only has only one or two guests, then he can make a very small amount. So it depends. Sometimes he's machmir, and sometimes it will be makel, depending on the amount of the guests. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi, Ze'eroi noisein odam yayin solul u'mayim slul nitoicha mishameres b'shabbos ve'eno choishes. A person can place wine that is solul and mayim that is solul, that means it's clear, on a mishameres, and there's no problem, because after all it's drinkable and it's clear, and therefore it's not going to be considered to be an effective type of borer if he puts it on the mishameres, even on Shabbos. Aval achuri loy. But if it is darkened, let's say the wine or the water is a little bit dark, then it would be problematic, it would be osir. The Gemara asks, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Oimer, Toired Adam Chavishal Yayin, Yeina Vishamareha, Venoisin Letocha Mishameres B'Shabbos Ve'ena Choishish. It says over here that he's able to mix, Toired means mix, the chavis of Yayin that has both Yayin and Shmarim together. And there you see that it does have a darkened type of coloring. And therefore there is a mixture over here. So how can you then do that? We just said before that only if it's solul, but if it's darkened, if it's achuri, not. Tirgum Ze'iri answered, Bein hagito shon. We're talking about between the gitos, between the wine pressing. And therefore, since in the wine pressing, it's darkened, it's also achurin, and it's still considered drinkable. People drink the wine when it's between the wine presses, when it's fresh from the wine press. So too then, if you would put on mishameres, it would become even also drinkable. It's not going to be significantly different, and therefore it's not an issue of borer. Misan nes hayayim besudar, in the Mishnah, the Gemara quotes the Mishnah that you can go ahead and strain wine with sudarin because it's a shinui. And we said in the Mishnah, it's talking about wine that started to becoming a little bit flaky, a little bit of white flakes inside the wine. But even though most people do strain such wine, but it's drinkable. He says when you do strain it with the sudar, you have to make sure that you're not going to then make a guma. Doesn't mean that when you pour it, it doesn't then go down a little bit, but it means that you cannot make a guma to then mechavein that it should then be, the liquid should go into one area, because that would be at least appearing to be more of an issue of borer. Ubekfifa mitzris, we said another shinui would be using a basket made out of twigs from a palm tree. Says the Gemara, Amarav Chia bar Ashim Arav, ubevashel yagbia mekarkoi shel kli tefach. You cannot pick this up higher than the bottom of the kli that is beneath it, a full tefach, because then it'll be a problem of oil arai. Amarav ai paroinko aflige diku apalge dikuba shari akule kuba oser. Rav says that if you take a rag, you can only put on half of a kuba on half of the kli, but not on the entire kli, because then it will be a problem if you're going to have a full tefach of an oil arai. Says the Gemara weiter, Omar Rav Papa lo nihadek inish tzinioso bepumei de kuzni de chavisa mishum de mechsi kimishameres. He says a person cannot take small pieces of wood and straw and put it in the small jug, the clay jug that he's going to be pouring wine into, because that will appear to be like a strainer. And therefore, even though it's not going to take out all of the big pieces, the big pieces will take out, even will take out all of the shmarim, but nonetheless it'll be appearing to be that he's straining, and therefore that would be problematic, it would be ulcer. The house of Rav Papa would pour slowly their wine or their beer from one kli to another kli. In other words, let's say you have a chavis, a barrel of beer. They would pour it out into other kli, and ultimately, when it gets to the bottom, so there will be the shmarim that will be on the bottom. So Gemara says, "Omar le Rav Acha medit Ravina, ha'ika nitzoitzis." How can they do that? Hooray, there's going to be drops at the end. So at the end when they pour, the drops will then come and separate from the shmarim. It'll probably be an issue of a boirer. Answers Gemara, Nitzaz lebe Rav Papa lechashi. Rav Papa was a beer maker, and therefore, in his household, when they would pour the last, they get to the bottom, the last few drops, they would discard, and therefore there wouldn't be an issue of separating those drops from the sentiments, from the shmarim.